The rusty key fell from the pages of Grandmother Ruth's Bible, like a secret finally ready to be told, clattering onto the hardwood floor of her bedroom, with a sound that seemed to echo through 40 years of carefully kept silence. I'd been packing her belongings for donation when the worn leather-bound book slipped from my hands, and now I knelt beside her bed, the same bed where she'd died peacefully in her sleep, just 7 days ago, staring at this small piece of metal that felt heavier than it should have. Tucked between the pages of Revelations was a note in Ruth's careful handwriting. Olivia, open the safe before it's too late. The truth dies with me unless you act. Third brick from the corner, behind the roses. You're a loving grandmother. My hands trembled as I read the words again. Ruth had been sharp as a tack until the end, but this felt like something from a thriller novel rather than a message from the woman who'd taught me to bake apple pie and insisted we say grace before every meal. What safe? What truth? And why did her final words carry such urgency? The rose garden behind her house had always been Ruth's pride and joy, a meticulously maintained sanctuary where she spent hours each morning tending to her beloved flowers. Now, in the fading August light, the roses seemed to lean inward like conspirators keeping secrets. I counted 3 bricks from the corner of the garden wall and found what I was looking for, a loose brick that came away easily in my hands. Behind it was a small wall safe, old but well-maintained, with a keyhole that matched the rusty key perfectly. My heart pounded as the safe door swung open, revealing a single manila folder thick with documents. The first item made my blood run cold. A handwritten list titled, The Morgan Family in Order, with names, dates, and methods of death recorded in Ruth's meticulous script. Linda Morgan, my mother. March 15, 2022. Car accident. Brake failure. Thomas Morgan, uncle. The 8th of July 2022. Heart attack. Digitalis poisoning. Patricia Morgan, aunt. November 20th, 2022. Suicide. Forced overdose. Michael Morgan, cousin. January 30th, 2023, drowning, held underwater. Sarah Morgan, second cousin. The 12th of May, 2023, house fire, arson. David Morgan, uncle. The 3rd of September, 2023, stroke, induced by injection. Each name was crossed out in red ink. At the bottom of the list, in fresh black ink that looked recently added, was my own name with a date that made my stomach drop. Olivia Morgan, August 27, 2025. Method TBD. Today was August 20, 2025. According to this list, I had exactly 7 days to live. I sank onto the garden bench Ruth had loved. The folder clutched against my chest as the magnitude of what I'd discovered crashed over me like a wave. 6 family members dead in just over 3 years, all deaths that had seemed tragic but natural at the time. My mother's car accident on that rainy March evening. Uncle Thomas collapsing at his desk, Aunt Patricia's overdose after months of depression following her husband's death. But according to Ruth's notes, none of them had been accidents. Someone had been systematically murdering my family, working their way through what looked like a predetermined list, and somehow my grandmother had known about it all along. The folder contained more than just the list. There were newspaper clippings about each death, copies of police reports, and what looked like surveillance photos of family members taken in the weeks before they died. Someone had been watching, planning, executing a careful campaign of murder that had gone completely undetected by law enforcement, and now they were coming for me. I thought about the phone call I'd received that morning, a hang-up when I answered, but I'd had the distinct feeling someone was listening, waiting. The car that had seemed to follow me to the grocery store yesterday. The sense I'd had lately of being watched, which I'd attributed to grief and paranoia following Ruth's death. Maybe it hadn't been paranoia after all. As I sat in Ruth's rose garden with the evidence of a family conspiracy in my lap, I realized that my grandmother's death might not have been natural either. The woman who'd uncovered a serial killer targeting our family had died conveniently just days before my name was supposed to come up on the list. Ruth hadn't just been leaving me a warning. She'd been passing me a baton in a race. I didn't even know I was running a race where the finish line was my own grave, scheduled for exactly 1 week from today. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spread Ruth's documents across my kitchen table and began the grim task of researching my own family's systematic destruction. Each death that I'd mourned as a terrible tragedy revealed itself to be something far more sinister when examined through the lens of Ruth's meticulous investigation. My mother Linda's car accident had occurred on a stretch of road she'd driven safely for 20 years. The police report noted brake failure, but Ruth's notes indicated she'd had the brakes serviced just 2 weeks prior. More damning was a receipt Ruth had kept for a private autopsy she'd commissioned, toxicology results showing traces of a paralytic agent in Linda's blood that would have made it impossible for her to steer or brake, even if the mechanical systems had been working. Uncle Thomas's heart attack had been attributed to stress and poor diet, but Ruth's copy of his medical records told a different story. The hospital had found digitalis in his system, a heart medication he'd never been prescribed, and in doses high enough to be lethal. The attending physician had noted it in the file, but had apparently been convinced by someone that Thomas had been self-medicating with his late wife's heart pills. The pattern continued through each death. Aunt Patricia's suicide overdose involved a combination of drugs she'd never had access to. Cousin Michael's drowning had occurred in 3 feet of water, despite his being an accomplished swimmer, with suspicious bruising on his shoulders that suggested he'd been held down. The house fire that killed Sarah had started in 3 separate locations, simultaneously, a clear sign of arson that had somehow been overlooked by investigators. But it was Uncle David's stroke that made me reach for my phone to call the police. Ruth's notes included a photograph of a small puncture wound on his neck that she'd taken at the funeral home, along with research she'd done on air embolisms and how they could be induced with a simple syringe to mimic stroke symptoms. Detective Hoffman, a tired voice answered on the 3rd ring. "My name is Olivia Morgan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to report multiple murders disguised as accidents and natural deaths." There was a pause. "Ma'am, it's 2 a.m. Can this wait until, Detective? My grandmother left me evidence that 6 members of my family have been murdered over the past 3 years. And according to her notes, I'm next on the list in 7 days. The pause was longer this time. "I'll be right over." Detective Ray Hoffman was younger than I'd expected, with intelligent eyes and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested he's seen enough tragedy to take even the most outlandish claims seriously. He examined Ruth's documents with professional thoroughness, occasionally asking questions that showed he was following the connections she'd made. "Your grandmother was quite the investigator," he said finally. "This level of detail, the cross-referencing of official reports with her own observations, she missed her calling as a detective. Do you believe her? Do you think someone really is killing my family?" Hoffman looked up from the photographs. "I think your grandmother uncovers something that got 6 people killed, and if she's right about the timeline, you're in immediate danger. The question is who's behind it and why they're targeting the Morgan family specifically." We spent the next 2 hours going through Ruth's notes, looking for patterns that might reveal the killer's identity. The deaths had occurred roughly every 4 months, suggesting careful planning rather than crimes of passion. Each victim had been isolated in some way, either living alone or separated from other family members when they died, and each had received what Ruth had documented as unusual contact from someone claiming to be conducting family genealogy research in the weeks before their death. "Did you receive any calls about family history recently?" Hoffman asked. My blood ran cold. "Last month, someone called saying they were working on a Morgan family tree for a genealogy website. They wanted to meet in person to go over some documents, but I was too busy with Ruth's care to schedule anything." "Did they give a name?" I tried to remember the conversation, but it had seemed so innocuous at the time. "Something generic, Smith maybe, or Johnson. They said they'd call back after Ruth's situation was resolved." Hoffman made notes in his phone. "We need to get you somewhere safe while we investigate this. Do you have somewhere you can stay? Someone who's not connected to your family?" I thought about my friend Jennifer's offer to house sit while she was out of town. It would get me away from my apartment, where someone clearly knew to find me, and Jennifer lived across town in a secure building with a doorman. "Yes, I think so." "Good. Pack light and don't tell anyone where you're going, not family, not close friends, no one." If your grandmother's right, whoever's doing this has been watching your family long enough to know your routines and relationships. As Hoffman prepared to leave with copies of Ruth's evidence, he paused at my door. Miss Morgan, I want you to know that I take this seriously. 6 deaths in 3 years, all in one family with this level of documentation. It's not coincidence. We're going to find who's responsible. But as I packed a bag in the pre-dawn darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that finding the killer might be the easy part. Understanding why someone wanted to eliminate every member of my family, that was the question that would keep me awake for whatever time I had left. Jennifer's apartment felt like a sanctuary as I settled in with my laptop and the copies Detective Hoffman had made of Ruth's files. But sanctuary or not, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. The killer had maintained their schedule perfectly for 3 years. What would make them deviate now just because their plan had been discovered? I decided to start with the one family member Ruth hadn't mentioned in her notes, my Uncle Marcus, my father's brother who lived 2 states away and had always been the family oddball. Marcus had attended every funeral, always with the same expression of distant sadness, but he'd never seemed particularly close to any of the victims. Maybe that was what had kept him alive. When I called, his voice sounded strained, older than I remembered from Ruth's funeral just a week ago. Olivia? Thank God. I was hoping you'd call. The relief in his voice was palpable. We need to talk. Not over the phone. Can you come here? Uncle Marcus, I can't travel right now. I'm in hiding. You found Ruth's safe, didn't you? The question hit me like a physical blow. She told me she was leaving you something, but I prayed you'd never have to open it. My hands shook as I gripped the phone. You knew? You knew about the list? I knew Ruth suspected something was wrong with all the deaths, but I didn't know she documented everything until you just confirmed it. Olivia, listen to me very carefully. The person doing this, they're not a stranger to our family. They're someone who knows us, someone who's been planning this for years. Who? My voice came out as barely a whisper. I can't say over the phone. It's too dangerous. But I can tell you this much, it goes back to your grandfather's will. When he died 15 years ago, there was a situation. A disagreement about the inheritance that split the family. Someone felt they were cheated out of what was rightfully theirs. I tried to remember my grandfather's funeral, but I'd been only 13 then, more concerned with missing school than with family finances. What kind of disagreement? Your grandfather owned more than just the house and a small savings account. There was property, investments, things most of the family didn't know about. When the will was read, certain people discovered they'd been left out entirely. A chill ran down my spine as the implications became clear. Someone is killing the beneficiaries. That's what Ruth believed. She spent the last 3 years researching every detail of the will, tracking what happened to each inheritance and correlating it with the deaths. Olivia, according to what she told me, you inherited more than anyone. Your portion was supposed to be held in trust until you turned 30. I was 29. My 30th birthday was in 3 months. But that doesn't make sense, I said, thinking frantically. If someone wanted the inheritance, why not just wait for me to die naturally? Why the elaborate murders? Marcus was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with a sadness that seemed to carry decades of weight. Because it's not just about money anymore, Olivia. It stopped being about money after the first death. Now it's about revenge, about punishing our family for what they see as a lifetime of exclusion and humiliation. Who was excluded? Who did grandfather leave out of the will? Someone who believed they were his child. Someone who spent their whole life thinking they were part of the Morgan family, only to discover at his death that they'd never been legally recognized, never been included in any of the family planning or inheritance. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. An illegitimate child. More than that, someone who was raised believing they were legitimate, who was part of family gatherings and holiday celebrations, who called your grandfather Dad for 40 years only to discover at his funeral that legally they didn't exist. I thought back to family gatherings over the years, trying to identify who might fit this description. But there were so many relatives, so many family friends who'd been treated like family, that narrowing it down seemed impossible. Marcus, I need names. Who are we talking about? I can't give you names over the phone. But, Olivia, there's something else you need to know. Ruth didn't just die in her sleep. The night before she died, she called me. She said she figured out who was behind the murders, and she was going to confront them. She was going to try to make a deal her silence in exchange for sparing you. The room tilted sideways as I processed what he was telling me. You think Ruth was murdered too? I think Ruth died because she tried to save you. And I think her death was supposed to look natural, so you wouldn't be suspicious when you found her note. The killer wanted you to have just enough information to be terrified, but not enough to identify them. Why? What's the point of terrifying me? Marcus's voice was barely audible when he answered. Because 30 years of anger doesn't just want you dead, Olivia. It wants you to suffer first. Detective Hoffman arrived at Jennifer's apartment the next morning with coffee and grim news. The medical examiner had agreed to expedite Ruth's autopsy based on the evidence I provided, and the preliminary results confirmed what Uncle Marcus had suspected: traces of the same paralytic agent found in my mother's system, administered in a dose that would have caused respiratory failure within hours. Your grandmother was murdered, he said, settling into Jennifer's kitchen chair with the weariness of someone who'd been up all night. Which means whoever's doing this accelerated their timeline when they realized she was getting close to the truth. I stared at the autopsy report, seeing Ruth's death transformed from peaceful passing to cold-blooded murder. How long do you think I actually have? Based on the pattern, they've been sticking to roughly 4-month intervals. Your cousin David died in September, which means you should have been safe until January. But Ruth's murder suggests they're no longer following their own rules. Hoffman pulled out a thick folder containing police reports from all 6 deaths. I spent the night going through these cases with fresh eyes, and your grandmother was right about everything. Each death was carefully planned and expertly executed. But there are patterns the original investigators missed because they weren't looking at them as connected. He spread crime scene photos across the table, creating a timeline of death that was almost surgical in its precision. The killer has medical knowledge, the drug combinations, the understanding of how to induce specific types of fatal reactions. They also have access to medical supplies and controlled substances. A doctor? Possibly. Or a nurse, paramedic, pharmacist, someone with both knowledge and access. He pointed to Ruth's notes about the digitalis poisoning. This particular drug combination would require someone who understands cardiac medication interactions. The dose was calculated to cause maximum damage while minimizing the chance of detection. I studied the photos, looking for details I missed before. What about the surveillance photos Ruth collected? Did you find anything there? Hoffman nodded grimly. That's the most disturbing part. These photos were taken with professional equipment, from positions that required extensive planning. Look at this one. He showed me a photo of my mother taken 3 days before her death, apparently leaving her office building. But it wasn't taken from street level. The angle suggested someone had been positioned on a rooftop or in an adjacent building with a telephoto lens. This level of surveillance requires resources and patience. We're not dealing with crimes of passion here. This is systematic stalking followed by calculated murder. Have you been able to identify who took them? We're working on it. The photos were printed on standard photo paper, but the digital forensics team is analyzing the image quality and metadata to determine what kind of camera was used. The problem is that all the victims' phones and computers were either destroyed in their deaths or cleaned afterward, another sign that we're dealing with someone who understands. Evidence. Hoffman showed me the final item from Ruth's safe, something I hadn't paid much attention to the night before. It was a family tree, hand-drawn, with names and relationships mapped out in careful detail, but several names had been crossed out in what looked like the same red ink used on the death list. Your grandmother was trying to identify who might have been excluded from your grandfather's will, Hoffman explained. According to this, there were 3 people who believed they were part of the Morgan family but weren't legally recognized. He pointed to names I didn't recognize. 2 of them died of natural causes in the years following your grandfather's death, genuine natural causes, according to their medical records. But the third one ... quotes. He paused, studying my reaction. The third one is still alive. Who? Dr. Catherine Morgan Wells. She's been using the Morgan name professionally for 30 years, claiming to be your grandfather's daughter from a previous relationship. She's a nurse practitioner specializing in geriatric care. The name meant nothing to me, but the profession made my blood run cold. A medical professional with access to drugs and knowledge of how to kill without detection. Someone who'd been using the Morgan name despite not being legally entitled to it. Where is she now? That's where it gets interesting. Dr. Morgan Wells has been working at different facilities around the region for the past 3 years, and according to her employment records, she was working near each victim in the weeks before they died. Hoffman pulled out a map with red pins marking the locations of each death and blue pins showing Dr. Morgan Wells' employment history. The pattern was undeniable. She'd been positioned within striking distance of every victim when they died. We have enough circumstantial evidence to bring her in for questioning, Hoffman said. But here's the problem: she disappeared 2 days ago, quit her job at the nursing home in Springfield, cleaned out her apartment, and vanished. 2 days ago was when Ruth died. Exactly. Which means she knows we're onto her, and she's accelerating her timeline. Hoffman met my eyes with an expression that was both determined and worried. Olivia, based on this evidence, I believe Dr. Catherine Morgan Wells has been systematically murdering your family for 3 years, and she's not going to stop until you're dead. But why wait until now? If she wanted revenge for being excluded from the will, why not just kill me 3 years ago when this started? Hoffman's expression grew darker. Because according to Ruth's research, you weren't just excluded from being mentioned in the will, you were specifically named as the primary beneficiary. Dr. Morgan Wells didn't just want you dead. She wanted you to watch everyone you loved die first, knowing you were next. She wanted you to suffer the way she suffered for 15 years. As the full scope of Catherine Morgan Wells' revenge became clear, I realized that Ruth's death hadn't just been about silencing a threat, it had been about removing my last protector before the final act of a tragedy 3 years in the making. The first sign that Catherine Morgan Wells had found me came through Jennifer's security system. At 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 4 days before my scheduled death, the building's cameras captured a figure in scrubs, walking purposefully through the lobby, nodding to the night doorman as if they belonged there. The timestamp showed they stayed in the building for exactly 7 minutes before leaving through the service exit. When I showed the footage to Detective Hoffman the next morning, his expression confirmed my worst fears. She's conducting surveillance, learning your routines, mapping the building's security, planning her approach. How did she even know I was here? I didn't tell anyone except you. Hoffman studied the grainy security footage on his laptop. She's been tracking your family for 3 years. She probably knows your friends, your habits, your backup plans. Jennifer's apartment might have seemed like a safe choice to you, but to someone who's been studying your life, it was predictable. I felt exposed, vulnerable, in a way that made my skin crawl. Every decision I'd made to protect myself had apparently been anticipated by someone who understood me better than I understood myself. We need to move you again, Hoffman said. Somewhere truly random, somewhere she couldn't predict. But even as he spoke, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against Hoffman's frantic gesturing, I answered. Hello, Olivia. The voice was warm, maternal, with a slight accent that reminded me of my grandmother's generation. I think it's time we met in person. Dr. Catherine Morgan Wells, I presume. A soft laugh. Catherine is fine. After all, we're family, even if your grandfather never acknowledged it. I was hoping we could talk before Saturday. There are things about your family you deserve to know before. Well, before our business is concluded, Hoffman was already on his radio, trying to trace the call, but I knew it was futile. Someone who'd evaded detection for 3 years wouldn't make the amateur mistake of calling from a traceable line. Why? I asked. Why did you kill them? What did my mother do to you? What did any of them do? They lived, Catherine said simply. They lived the lives that should have been mine, inherited the money that should have been mine, carried the family name I was denied my entire life. Your grandfather raised me, Olivia. He attended my school plays, walked me down the aisle at my first wedding, held my children when they were born. And when he died, I discovered it had all been a lie. So you decided to commit mass murder. I decided to correct an injustice. Every dollar your mother inherited should have been mine. Every family gathering your uncle attended should have included me as an equal, not as the illegitimate embarrassment hidden in plain sight. The pain in her voice was real. Decades of hurt and rejection that had fermented into something toxic and dangerous. But sympathy for her circumstances couldn't override the horror of her solution. And me? What did I do to deserve death? You were born into the position that should have been mine. You're the youngest generation, the future of the Morgan family, the inheritor of everything I was denied. Your death completes the circle, Olivia. It ends the family that never wanted me as anything more than a dirty secret. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone while Hoffman coordinated with his team to analyze whatever digital traces the call might have left. But I knew Catherine was too smart to leave evidence. She'd been planning this conversation, like everything else, with the meticulous care of someone who'd spent years perfecting their approach. We're moving you now, Hoffman said, closing his laptop. Safe house, full protection detail, until we can locate her. But as we prepared to leave Jennifer's apartment, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. On the kitchen counter, next to where I'd been sitting during Catherine's call, was a single red rose, one of the varieties from Ruth's garden. It hadn't been there when we'd arrived that morning. Catherine hadn't just been watching the building. She'd been inside the apartment, probably while Hoffman and I were reviewing the security footage. She could have killed me then, could have completed her mission 3 days early. But she'd chosen to leave a calling card instead, a message that our final confrontation would happen on her terms, at the time and place of her choosing. As Hoffman's team swept the apartment for other evidence of Catherine's presence, I realized that the safe house wouldn't protect me. Catherine Morgan Wells had been studying my family for 3 years, had infiltrated medical facilities and crime scenes, had evaded detection by multiple police departments. A woman that resourceful wouldn't be stopped by a change of location and a few armed guards. She'd simply adapt her plan and find another way to ensure that August 27th would be my last day alive. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in a suburban development 40 minutes from downtown, the kind of place where serial killers were supposed to be unable to find their targets. But as Detective Hoffman's team set up surveillance equipment and established security protocols, I couldn't shake Catherine's words from our phone conversation. She'd spent 3 years studying my family's patterns and relationships. How long would it take someone that thorough to locate a police safe house? My answer came at sunset on August 24th, when a pizza delivery car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the reinforced windows as a young man in a delivery uniform approached the front door, carrying what looked like a standard pizza box. The 2 officers stationed outside waved him through after checking his ID and vehicle registration, but something about the delivery felt wrong. We hadn't ordered pizza, and the security protocols specifically prohibited outside food deliveries. I was reaching for the panic button Hoffman had given me when the delivery man looked directly at me through the window and smiled. It was a woman's smile on a man's face, surgical precision in features that looked familiar despite the masculine presentation. Catherine Morgan Wells had found me again, and this time she was walking right up to the front door. The officers realized something was wrong when the delivery man produced a syringe instead of a receipt, but Catherine was faster than anyone had anticipated. She injected the first officer before he could draw his weapon, then used his collapsing body as a shield while she dealt with the second one. I ran for the back of the house, my heart hammering as I heard sounds of struggle from the front porch. The tactical team Hoffman had positioned around the property should have responded within seconds, but the silence stretching behind me suggested that Catherine had somehow neutralized them as well. The back door was reinforced and locked, but panic gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I managed to force it open and stumble into the backyard just as Catherine's voice called out from inside the house. Olivia, there's no point in running. I've spent 3 years learning everything about you, your fears, your habits, your instinctive reactions to stress. I know exactly where you'll go. She was right, and I knew it. Every decision I made was probably predictable to someone who'd been studying my psychological profile for years. But predictable or not, I had to try. I ran through the suburban neighborhood as darkness fell, ducking between houses, and trying to stay off the main streets where Catherine might have positioned additional resources. My phone had no signal. She'd probably deployed some kind of jamming device, but I remember seeing a fire station 6 blocks away when we'd arrived at the safe house. I was 3 blocks from potential safety when a figure stepped out from behind a parked car, blocking my path. In the streetlight, I could see that Catherine had abandoned her pizza delivery disguise for something more practical: dark clothing, medical gloves, and a bag that probably contained enough pharmaceutical supplies to kill me several different ways. "Hello, Olivia," she said calmly. "You're right on schedule. The police know where you are," I gasped, trying to catch my breath while calculating the distance to the nearest house with lights on. "Detective Hoffman's team will be here any minute," Catherine smiled. Detective Hoffman's team is currently dealing with a multiple casualty incident at the safe house. Gas leak explosion. Very tragic. I'm afraid they'll be too busy with rescue operations to worry about tracking down one missing witness. The implications hit me like a physical blow. She murdered the officers assigned to protect me, probably destroyed the safe house itself, and eliminated any immediate hope of police backup. We were alone on a suburban street with no witnesses and no help coming. "Before we proceed," Catherine continued, reaching into her bag with deliberate slowness, "I want you to understand something about your family that Ruth never told you. Something that changes everything you think you know about why you deserve to die. Nothing you say will justify what you've done, won't it?" Catherine pulled out a manila folder that looked identical to the one Ruth had left in her safe. "What if I told you that your grandfather didn't just exclude me from his will, he actively stole money that belonged to me? What if I told you that every dollar your family inherited was taken from my children's college funds, my mortgage payments, my medical bills?" She opened the folder and showed me documents I couldn't read in the dim streetlight, but her voice carried the conviction of someone who'd spent years building a case for revenge. "What if I told you that your beloved grandmother Ruth knew about the theft and helped cover it up for 15 years? What if I told you that every member of your family who died knew they were living on money stolen from my family, and not one of them ever tried to make it right?" The certainty in her voice was more frightening than her physical presence. This wasn't the ranting of a delusional killer, it was the controlled anger of someone who believed their cause was just. "Even if that's true," I said, backing slowly toward what I hoped was safety, "it doesn't justify murder." Catherine's smile was sad now, almost pitying. "Doesn't it, Olivia? What would you do if someone stole 30 years of your life? What would you do if you discovered that the family you loved had been laughing at you behind your back for decades?" Catherine's question hung in the air between us as I continued backing away, my mind racing through everything I thought I knew about my family's finances. Grandfather had been comfortable but not wealthy, at least, that's what I'd always believed. But if Catherine was telling the truth about stolen money, it would explain how my mother had afforded the house I'd grown up in, how Uncle Thomas had funded his children's private school educations, how the family had maintained a lifestyle that seemed beyond their apparent means. "I can see you're starting to understand," Catherine said, following my retreat with the patient pace of a hunter who knew her prey was trapped. "The money your grandfather left in trust for you? That was supposed to be my daughter's inheritance. She died of cancer 2 years ago because I couldn't afford the experimental treatment that might have saved her." The pain in her voice was raw, immediate, the kind of grief that transforms rational people into instruments of vengeance. But it was the next revelation that stopped me cold. "Your daughter died 2 years ago," I repeated slowly. "But you've been killing my family for 3 years." Catherine's expression changed, the mask of justified righteousness slipping for just a moment to reveal something more complex underneath. "Yes, the killings began before Emma's diagnosis, but her death made them necessary." The admission created a crack in her carefully constructed narrative of revenge. If her daughter had been alive when the murder started, then Catherine's motivation hadn't been about saving her, it had been about something else entirely. "You started killing my family before you had a reason," I said, seizing on the inconsistency. "Your daughter's death didn't drive you to murder. Murder drove you to let your daughter die." For the first time since I'd met her, Catherine looked uncertain. "You don't understand. The money was never about your daughter's medical bills. I interrupted, pieces falling into place with sudden clarity. You wanted revenge against my grandfather, against my family, and when your daughter got sick, you chose to spend your resources on surveillance and murder instead of treatment. Catherine's hand tightened on whatever weapon she was concealing in her bag. Shut up. You let your own daughter die so you could afford to kill mine, I continued, the horrible truth spilling out before I could stop myself. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You're not avenging your daughter's death. You're trying to distract yourself from the guilt of causing it. Shut up. Catherine's composure finally cracked, the calm professional facade dissolving into the raw fury of someone whose deepest shame had been exposed. You don't know anything about my choices, about what I sacrificed. You sacrificed your daughter for revenge, I said, continuing to back away even as Catherine's anger made her more dangerous. And now you're planning to kill me tomorrow because facing the truth about what kind of mother you really were is too painful. Catherine lunged forward, but her emotional breakdown had disrupted her careful planning. Instead of the controlled movements of a trained killer, she moved with the desperate clumsiness of someone who'd lost the psychological upper hand. I dodged her initial attack and ran toward the fire station, screaming for help as loudly as I could. Behind me, I could hear Catherine pursuing, but her professional calm had been replaced by the kind of rage that made people careless. The fire station's bay doors were closed, but lights were on in the administrative office. I pounded on the glass door until a firefighter in uniform opened it, took one look at my panicked face and Catherine's approaching figure, and immediately called for backup. Within minutes, the street was flooded with emergency vehicles. Catherine made no attempt to flee. She stood in the middle of the road with her hands at her sides, staring at me with an expression of pure hatred as police officers surrounded her. But as Detective Hoffman arrived to take her into custody, Catherine called out words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Ask him about the real reason Ruth died, Olivia. Ask him why he was so eager to help you investigate your own family. Hoffman's face went pale as Catherine was loaded into the police car, and I realized that even with the killer in custody, the secrets that had destroyed my family were far from fully revealed. August 27th was still 2 days away, and I was beginning to suspect that the date on Catherine's list might not have been a deadline for my death. It might have been a deadline for something else entirely. Detective Hoffman's hands shook as he lit his third cigarette in 10 minutes. Standing in the fire station parking lot while Catherine Morgan Wells was processed and transported to county lockup. The case should have been closed. Killer apprehended, motive established, victims identified. But Catherine's final words had created a new mystery that threatened to unravel everything. I thought I understood about my family's destruction. We need to talk, I told Hoffman, studying his face for signs of the deception Catherine had implied. About what she said about Ruth's death, about why you were so interested in helping me. Hoffman took a long drag from his cigarette and stared at the ground. There are things about this case I haven't told you, Olivia. Things that weren't relevant when we were trying to catch Catherine. Weren't relevant, or would have complicated your investigation. He looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than they had just hours earlier. Both, maybe. The truth is, I've been investigating deaths in the Morgan family for longer than 3 years. Your grandfather's death was the first one that caught my attention. The admission hit me like a physical blow. Grandfather died of natural causes. His doctor confirmed it. There was no autopsy, because I was a rookie detective then, and I didn't have enough evidence to justify ordering one. But there were inconsistencies that bothered me. Witnesses who saw him talking to a woman matching Catherine's description the day he died. A sudden change in his will just 2 weeks before his death that cut several people out of their inheritances. Hoffman dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel with more force than necessary. I started building a file on suspicious deaths in your family 5 years ago. When your mother died, I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't prove it. Same with your uncle, your aunt, your cousins. I was always one step behind, always missing the evidence I needed. So when I called you with Ruth's documentation, I saw a chance to finally get justice for 15 years worth of victims. He met my eyes with an expression of desperate honesty. But there's something else, Olivia. Something that Catherine knew and I was hoping wouldn't come out. I waited. knowing that whatever he was about to reveal would change everything once again. "I'm not just any detective who happened to catch this case," Hoffman said quietly. "I'm Richard Morgan's son. Your grandfather was my father too." The world tilted sideways as the implications crashed over me. Detective Ray Hoffman, the man I trusted to protect me, the law enforcement officer who'd been investigating my family's murders, was another illegitimate child seeking revenge for being excluded from his father's will. "You're working with Catherine," I said, backing away from him with the same instinctive fear I'd felt facing her. "This has all been some elaborate setup to—" "No." Hoffman's voice was firm, desperate. "Olivia, I know how this looks, but I was trying to catch her. Everything I told you about the investigation was true. I wanted justice for our family, not more death." "Our family?" "You're my half-sister," Hoffman said, the words hanging heavy in the night air. Catherine was right about one thing. Our father has several relationships over the years that produced children he never acknowledged. But unlike Catherine, I didn't want revenge. I wanted to protect the family members who are still alive. I studied his face, looking for signs of deception, trying to reconcile this revelation with 3 days of apparent cooperation and protection. "If you're really my brother, why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" "Because I thought it would compromise the investigation. Because I thought you'd trust me less if you knew I had a personal stake in the outcome." He ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of exhaustion and defeat. "Because I've been trying to be a good cop instead of a vengeful son. And I thought the distinction mattered. Does Catherine know you're investigating the case?" "She figured it out, obviously. Probably did background research on everyone involved in the investigation and discovered my parentage." Hoffman looked toward the police car where Catherine was being held. "That's why she made her final move early. She realized that if I solved the case and revealed her identity, she'd lose her chance at completing her revenge." The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they created was more complex than simple good versus evil. 2 of my father's illegitimate children, both excluded from his will, both seeking justice in their own way. One had become a killer, the other a cop, but both had been shaped by the same fundamental rejection. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now Catherine goes to trial for 6 murders, and you tried to rebuild your life knowing the truth about our family's secrets." Hoffman met my eyes with an expression that mixed hope and resignation. "If you want, we could try to be the family our father never let us be. Brother and sister, connected by something more positive than shared tragedy." I looked at this man who claimed to be my half-brother, who'd spent years seeking justice for murders I didn't even know were murders, who'd protected me from a killer while keeping his own connection to the case secret. Tomorrow was August 27th, the day Catherine had scheduled for my death. Instead of dying, I'd be testifying about the night I'd barely survived, beginning the long process of helping to convict the woman who destroyed my family. But as I stood in that fire station parking lot, I realized that Catherine Morgan Wells had accomplished something she probably hadn't intended. She'd revealed the existence of family members I'd never known I had, siblings who'd been shaped by the same secrets and exclusions that had driven her to murder. The Morgan family wasn't extinct after all. It was just more complicated than I'd ever imagined. The truth about my family began unraveling the moment Catherine Morgan Wells' lawyer requested a psychological evaluation. Dr. Sarah Chun, the court-appointed psychiatrist, spent 3 weeks interviewing Catherine, reviewing her medical history, and constructing a psychological profile that would determine whether she was competent to stand trial for 6 murders. What Dr. Chun discovered changed everything. "I need to speak with you privately," she told me as I arrived at the courthouse for Catherine's competency hearing. "There are aspects of Miss Morgan Wells' mental state that directly impact her safety and understanding of this case." We sat in a small conference room while Dr. Chun opened a thick file that contained weeks of interviews, psychological tests, and medical records spanning Catherine's entire adult life. "Miss Morgan, Catherine Morgan Wells has been suffering from dissociative identity disorder for approximately 20 years. Dr. Chun began. What we initially interpreted as calculated, premeditated murder was actually the result of multiple personalities acting independently, often without conscious knowledge of each other's actions." I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. You're saying Catherine has multiple personalities, at least 4 distinct identities that we've been able to document. The primary personality, the one you've been interacting with, genuinely believed she was avenging wrongs done to her family. But there was another personality that was far more disturbed, focused entirely on eliminating anyone who carried the Morgan name. Dr. Chun showed me transcripts of interviews where Catherine's voice, mannerisms, and even handwriting changed dramatically as different personalities emerged. But here's what's most disturbing. One of Catherine's personalities has been corresponding with someone else who shares her obsession with your family. What do you mean? Catherine wasn't working alone, Miss Morgan. One of her personalities was in regular contact with another individual who has been planning these murders for far longer than we initially realized. Someone who used Catherine's mental illness as cover for their own agenda. The room felt suddenly cold as Dr. Chun pulled out photocopied letters written in handwriting I didn't recognize. These correspondence showed detailed discussions of each victim's routine, suggestions for murder methods, and most importantly, a clear indication that Catherine's contact had independent access to your family members. I read the letters with growing horror. They contained information about my mother's work schedule, Uncle Thomas's medical appointments, intimate details about family members' private lives that Catherine couldn't have gathered through surveillance alone. Who wrote these letters? Dr. Chun met my eyes with an expression of professional concern that barely concealed personal alarm. Someone signing themselves RH. Someone who had been planning your family's destruction since your grandfather's death 15 years ago, and who used Catherine's mental illness as the perfect weapon to accomplish it. R.H. Ray Hoffman. My alleged half-brother, the detective who'd been investigating my family's murders, had been orchestrating them all along. Detective Hoffman manipulated Catherine's personalities, feeding her information and encouragement, while positioning himself as the investigating officer who would control the narrative of the case, Dr. Chung continued. According to Catherine's psychiatric interviews, she genuinely believed she was acting alone. Her primary personality had no conscious memory of the correspondence or the outside influence. I thought about all the times Hoffman had been perfectly positioned to help me, all the evidence he'd provided, all the insights that had seemed almost too good to be true. He'd been controlling the investigation from both sides, ensuring that Catherine would be caught only after completing her mission. But Catherine was arrested before she could kill me, I said. If Hoffman was controlling her, why did he allow her to be captured? Dr. Chun's expression grew darker. Because according to Catherine's correspondence, your death was never the end goal. It was a catalyst. The letters indicate that R.H. has been building a case to prove that your grandfather's will was fraudulent, that all of his acknowledged children's inheritances were illegally obtained. The implications were staggering. He wanted my family dead so he could claim their inheritances. More than that, with all the legal heirs eliminated, Detective Hoffman would be the sole surviving claimant to your grandfather's estate. He's been systematically murdering his own siblings to steal their inheritances, using Catherine's mental illness as the perfect cover. But I'm still alive. Dr. Chun leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Miss Morgan, according to the correspondence, Detective Hoffman never intended for Catherine to kill you on August 27th. That date wasn't a deadline for your death, it was a deadline for you to be arrested as Catherine's accomplice. The room spun around me as the final piece of Hoffman's plan became clear. He's been setting me up. The evidence suggests that Detective Hoffman planned to discover proof that you and Catherine had been working together to eliminate family members, possibly as a murder-for-hire scheme. With you in prison for conspiracy and Catherine in a psychiatric facility, he would be the only remaining Morgan family member with a legal claim to the estate. I thought about all the times Hoffman had encouraged me to research my family's deaths, all the evidence he'd helped me collect, all the statements he'd recorded. He'd been documenting my knowledge of the murders not to build a case against Catherine, but to build a case against me. Dr. Chun, I said quietly, where is Detective Hoffman now? Her face went pale. He requested permission to interview Catherine before the competency hearing. He's with her right now, supposedly conducting final investigative interviews. But I knew better. Ray Hoffman wasn't conducting interviews, he was eliminating the last witness who could expose his 15-year plan to steal his father's legacy through systematic fratricide. August 27th had finally arrived, and the real killer was about to complete his masterpiece. I found them in the secure interview room at the county's psychiatric facility, where Hoffman had positioned himself as the investigating officer conducting one final interview with Catherine before her competency hearing. Through the observation window, I could see him sitting across from her, his hands resting on the table in what appeared to be a casual conversation between detective and suspect. But Catherine's posture told a different story. She was pressed against the back of her chair, eyes wide with the kind of terror that suggested she was finally understanding the full scope of how she'd been manipulated. Dr. Chung called security the moment I left her office. I said to the guard stationed outside the interview room, "Detective Hoffman is not authorized to be conducting any interviews today." The guard looked confused, checking his clipboard for authorization that wouldn't be there. But he showed proper credentials, said it was part of the ongoing investigation. It's part of an ongoing murder plot. I interrupted, pushing past him toward the interview room door. "Detective Hoffman has been using Catherine to eliminate our family members. And now he's here to silence the only witness who can expose him." Through the glass, I could see Hoffman's hand moving slowly towards something in his jacket, probably the same kind of syringe Catherine had used on her victims. The symmetry was perfect. The investigating detective, overcome with grief about his inability to solve the case, kills the suspected murderer in a moment of justice-seeking rage, then himself. 2 more deaths to add to the 15-year count, with all evidence pointing to a tragic conclusion rather than a calculated plan. I yanked open the interview room door, just as Hoffman withdrew the syringe from his jacket. "It's over, Ray. Dr. Chen found the letters. We know everything." Hoffman's hand froze halfway to Catherine's neck, his expression shifting from predatory focus to the kind of calm calculation I'd mistaken for professional competence. "Olivia, you're supposed to be in protective custody. Protective custody from the wrong person, apparently." I stayed in the doorway, knowing that backup was coming but uncertain whether it would arrive in time. "How long have you been planning this? Since grandfather's funeral? Since you realized you've been excluded from his will?" Catherine was staring at both of us with an expression of dawning comprehension. "You," she whispered to Hoffman, "you wrote the letters. You told me about the money, about the injustices, about how they all deserved to die." "I told your alternate personality," Hoffman corrected gently. "The part of you that was angry enough to act on information that your primary consciousness couldn't have obtained alone." He looked at me with something that might have been admiration. "It was brilliant, really. Catherine's mental illness provided the perfect cover for murders I couldn't have committed without arousing suspicion. You manipulated a mentally ill woman into becoming a serial killer. I provided guidance to someone who was already predisposed toward violence," Hoffman said, as if the distinction mattered. "Catherine wanted to hurt our family long before I made contact with her. I simply helped her channel that desire more effectively." The sound of running footsteps in the hallway told me that security was finally responding, but Hoffman heard them too. His grip tightened on the syringe as he calculated whether he had time to complete his original plan. "It doesn't matter now," he said. "Even if you've discovered the correspondence, there's no physical evidence linking me to any of the actual murders. Catherine committed them all. At worst, I'll be charged with providing assistance to a mentally incompetent person, probably reduced to counseling and probation, unless Catherine testifies against you. Catherine has dissociative identity disorder. Her testimony will be inadmissible in any court." Hoffman smiled with the confidence of someone who'd spent 15 years perfecting his plan. "And even if it weren't, she'd be too dead to provide it." But as he lunged forward with the syringe, Catherine proved that her mental illness hadn't destroyed her survival instincts. She rolled sideways off her chair, putting the table between herself and Hoffman while screaming for help in a voice that carried absolute terror. The security guards burst through the door, just as Hoffman realized his perfect plan was disintegrating. Instead of the final murders that would have sealed his revenge, he found himself surrounded by witnesses, evidence, and the collapse of 15 years of patient manipulation. As they restrained him, Hoffman looked at me with an expression that mixed hatred with something that might have been respect. You know, Olivia, in a different world, we could have been allies. We could have worked together to get justice for what our father did to us. Justice doesn't involve murdering innocent people, I said, watching as they placed him in handcuffs that seemed somehow inadequate for the scope of his crimes. Doesn't it? Hoffman asked as they led him away. What would you call what happened to us? What would you call a father who creates children and then pretends they don't exist? 6 months later, I stood in the cemetery where my mother, my uncle, my aunt, and my cousins were buried, victims of a revenge plot 15 years in the making. Detective Ray Hoffman had been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Catherine Morgan Wells had been committed to a secure psychiatric facility where she was receiving treatment for her dissociative identity disorder. The Morgan family fortune, the inheritance that had cost so many lives, turned out to be smaller than anyone had imagined. After legal fees and estate taxes, there wasn't enough left to justify a single murder, let alone systematic fratricide. But standing among the graves of people who died for money that barely existed, I realized that the inheritance had never really been about finances. It had been about recognition, about belonging, about the fundamental human need to be acknowledged by the people who create us. Ray Hoffman and Catherine Morgan Wells had spent decades seeking the kind of family acceptance that can be bought or stolen or inherited. In trying to claim it through violence, they destroyed the very thing they'd been desperate to join. I was the sole surviving member of the Morgan family now, but I wasn't alone. The investigation had revealed other illegitimate siblings, other children my grandfather had never acknowledged, other people shaped by the same exclusion that had driven 2 of them to murder. Some of those siblings wanted nothing to do with the Morgan name or legacy. Others were interested in building relationships based on shared experience rather than shared genetics. As I left the cemetery that day, I carried with me my grandmother Ruth's Bible, not for the secrets it might contain, but for the peace it represented. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and the cycle of revenge that had defined my family for 15 years was finally broken. The Morgan family was starting over, built on honesty instead of secrets, inclusion instead of exclusion, and the understanding that family is something you choose to create, not something you inherit or steal.